The crisp white snow that covered the lawns could not hide the unease in the air. Every family felt it, every whispered conversation carried it, an unspoken acknowledgement that their lives were now caught in a battle against the very man meant to protect their community. The Millers knew they could not fight Richard alone. The evidence they had gathered was strong, but one family's word would never be enough to topple an HOA president who had ruled for years through fear and manipulation. They needed unity. They needed strength in numbers. So they began reaching out. One by one, neighbors were invited into their living room, where stacks of evidence were laid bare. The Millers showed foreclosure filings, fraudulent fines, and proof of Richard's connections to shady real estate sales. At first, there was hesitation. Years of intimidation had left scars, but as the evidence mounted, hesitation turned into outrage. Families who once believed they were isolated victims now saw they had been part of a larger scheme. It was in those meetings that bonds were forged. Families who had barely spoken beyond a polite wave at the mailbox now shared their stories like war veterans. Each tale added fuel to the fire. A single mother forced to sell after endless fines, an elderly couple harassed until they gave up their house, and a young family nearly bankrupted by fabricated violations. The scope of Richard's abuse was staggering, and it was no longer a secret. Together, the residents formed a plan. They would call a special meeting of the HOA, a legal right within their bylaws, and demand a vote of no confidence in Richard's leadership. If they could rally enough signatures, they could force his removal. It would not be easy. Richard had loyalists who benefited from his power, and fear still lingered in many hearts. But it was their best chance. Word spread quietly, hand-delivered notes, slipped under doors, phone calls made late at night, conversations held in hushed tones while children played nearby. The resistance grew, until nearly every household had pledged their support. For the first time, Richard's iron grip on the community began to weaken. But Richard was not blind. He noticed the shift, the cold stares at meetings, the hushed whispers as he passed, the sudden courage in neighbors who once bowed their heads. His paranoia sharpened into rage. The fines grew harsher, letters more threatening, and surveillance more invasive. He sent notices accusing families of conspiring against the HOA, twisting rules into weapons. Some neighbors received mysterious late-night phone calls with no voice on the other end. Others found threatening notes taped to their doors. Then came the intimidation. Families who had spoken out found their cars keyed, their trash scattered across their lawns, their mail tampered with. No one could prove it was Richard, but everyone knew. The message was clear. Defy me, and you will suffer. For a moment, fear threatened to undo everything. Some families withdrew, worried about their jobs, their children, their safety. But the Millers pressed forward, reminding everyone of what was at stake. If Richard succeeded, more families would lose their homes, more lives would be ruined. Backing down was no longer an option. The day of the special meeting arrived. It was held in the community center, a place that had once hosted cheerful events, but now felt like a battlefield. The room was packed, every seat filled, tension crackling in the air. At the front sat Richard, his face set in a mask of confidence, though his eyes betrayed flickers of unease. As the meeting began, voices rose, not in anger, but in unity. One by one, families stood and recounted their experiences. They held up letters, showed photos, described harassment in detail. The Millers presented their evidence binder, laying bare Richard's schemes for all to see. The truth was no longer whispered in shadows. It was shouted in the open. What had once been rumor was now undeniable proof of embezzlement and fraud. It was the weapon the Millers needed, but using it meant escalating the war to a level no one had imagined. Richard seemed to sense they were closing in. His behavior grew erratic, his once calm mask now replaced with open hostility. He lurked near the Millers' home at night, his car idling at the end of their street. Neighbors reported seeing him digging through trash cans, desperate for information he could use against them. It was no longer a battle of rules and fines. It was a personal vendetta, one that had consumed him entirely. The community, once united, began to fracture under the pressure. Some families, terrified by the lawsuits and vandalism, retreated into silence. Others doubled down, determined to see justice served no matter the cost. The neighborhood had become a war zone in all but name, with Richard striking from the shadows and the Millers fighting to keep the truth alive. The tension reached a breaking point when the Millers returned home one evening to find a large for sale sign once again planted in their yard. Only this time, it wasn't a quiet attempt. The sign was bold, with their address listed publicly online as available immediately. Real estate agents began calling their phone, asking for showings. Richard had taken his scam to the next level, openly trying to sell their house as if he still controlled the HOA. It was the final straw. The Millers knew they couldn't wait any longer. With evidence in hand, they reached out to higher authorities, law enforcement, prosecutors, and even investigative journalists who specialized in exposing corruption. The battle had moved beyond the neighborhood now. It was no longer about one family or one community. It was about bringing down a man who had built his empire on lies. And as Richard watched the neighborhood he once led slip further from his grasp, he prepared for his most desperate move yet, a final act that would either destroy his enemies or drag him down with them. The neighborhood had endured months of fear, intimidation, and chaos. What had once been a quiet suburban haven was now a battlefield scarred by Richard's relentless campaign of control. But behind the fear, a storm was building, one fueled not by anger alone, but by truth. And truth, when finally unleashed, can be more devastating than any weapon. The Millers, armed with evidence of Richard's financial crimes, reached out to local authorities. At first, the process felt slow, bogged down by paperwork and bureaucracy. But once investigators saw the evidence, bank transfers tied to shell companies, fraudulent foreclosure filings, and proof of illegal property listings, the case shifted from speculation to criminal investigation. Richard was no longer just an overreaching HOA president. He was the prime suspect in a large-scale fraud case. Journalists soon picked up the story. Within weeks, headlines blared across local news. HOA president accused of selling homes without permission. Cameras appeared at the edges of the neighborhood, reporters eager to capture sound bites from families who had been victims of Richard's schemes. For years, Richard had ruled through silence and intimidation. Now, his misdeeds were public, broadcast for all to see. The pressure mounted. Lawsuits Richard had filed against neighbors began to crumble in court as judges saw the evidence against him. His smear campaigns online were drowned out by news articles detailing his corruption. Families who once lived in fear now stood tall, their voices amplified by the growing chorus of public outrage. But Richard did not go quietly. Cornered, he lashed out in desperation. He stormed into a community meeting uninvited, shouting accusations, waving papers in the air, claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy. His words fell flat. The once intimidated neighbors now met him with cold stares, their silence louder than his rage. What they found was a trail of failures. Years earlier, Richard had been involved in a construction company that went bankrupt under mysterious circumstances. Before that, there were whispers of fraudulent investments, of lawsuits quietly settled behind closed doors. Each failure left him deeper in debt until finally, he resurfaced as the savior of their HOA, promising to restore order and value to the neighborhood. But the records revealed more. Richard had quietly transferred ownership of several properties into shell companies connected to his relatives. These weren't coincidences. They were patterns. Families that had voluntarily sold their homes under his pressure often found their houses resold within months at enormous profit. The buyers, always linked to the same small circle of associates. The Millers realized they weren't just dealing with an overbearing HOA president. They were dealing with a man who had built an entire scheme, one that preyed on trust and fear, turning a peaceful neighborhood into his private marketplace. One night, while sifting through yet another stack of public documents, the Millers stumbled upon the most damning evidence yet: foreclosure filings initiated by the HOA against several families. These weren't ordinary cases of unpaid dues. They were inflated fines engineered by Richard himself, and at the bottom of each filing was his signature, authorizing the process that would strip families of their homes. The discovery left them shaken. Richard wasn't threatening foreclosure as a bluff. He had already done it, repeatedly, and no one had dared stop him. Meanwhile, signs of Richard's paranoia began to show. He patrolled the neighborhood in his car late at night, headlights sweeping across driveways and windows. Security cameras appeared on his property, pointing outward like watchful eyes. He spoke less at meetings, but his silence carried more menace than his words ever did. Residents whispered that he was keeping files on families, that he knew who was loyal and who was plotting against him. The Millers pressed on, knowing time was running short. Richard had already listed their house without consent. It was only a matter of time before he escalated, perhaps filing foreclosure papers against them as he had done to others. Their only hope was to expose him before that happened. But exposure came with risk. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous Richard became. One evening, the Millers returned home to find their mailbox torn from its post, its contents scattered across the yard. Among the debris was a single typed note: "Stop digging or you'll regret it." Fear rippled through the family, but so did resolve. The threat only confirmed what they already knew. They were close to the truth, close to unraveling the carefully woven web Richard had spun. And if they stopped now, everything they had endured would be for nothing. The next step was clear. They would need to bring in outside help, attorneys, perhaps even investigators. But to do that, they would need the community's full support. And convincing frightened neighbors to stand openly against Richard would not be easy. As winter deepened, so too did the tension. The quiet suburban streets, once filled with laughter and holiday lights, now carried an unspoken dread. Richard's shadow stretched over every home, every family, every whispered conversation behind closed doors. And yet, behind that shadow, a fire was building. The Millers weren't alone anymore. The neighborhood was waking up, and Richard's grip was beginning to slip. The stage was set for confrontation. What remained to be seen was whether the truth could be exposed before Richard struck his most devastating blow. By the time the new year arrived, the neighborhood was no longer the same quiet sanctuary it once appeared to be. The neighborhood had always looked like a picture-perfect community. Rows of neatly maintained homes, trimmed hedges and driveways polished enough to reflect sunlight. At first glance, it was the kind of place people dreamed about raising families in, where children rode bicycles without fear, and neighbors waved across manicured lawns. But beneath that glossy exterior, power and control simmered like an unseen storm, waiting to break. It all began when the Homeowners Association announced a new set of rules at the monthly meeting. The president, a man named Richard, had been running the HOA for years, gaining more influence with every passing season. His tone was always commanding, and his presence dominated every gathering. Richard thrived on authority, often reminding homeowners that the HOA owns the neighborhood's order. At first, most residents complied with his policies, brushing off the rules as minor inconveniences. No holiday decorations outside of approved dates. No vehicles parked on the street overnight. No home improvements without signed approval. The community had tolerated his iron grip, until Richard set his sights on something far more sinister. It started with subtle warnings slipped into mailboxes, notes citing violations that didn't exist, claims of uncut grass, peeling paint, or improper fencing. Many homeowners dismissed these letters as clerical errors, but the pattern grew too frequent to ignore. Families began whispering in hushed tones about inflated fines, about Richard demanding money for infractions no one else could see. Then came the strange conversations. Neighbors mentioned how Richard had privately approached them with offers, insisting that certain houses were better off sold for the good of the neighborhood. He spoke of buyers waiting, as if he controlled the market itself. People laughed off the remarks, assuming he was exaggerate. But those words would soon take on a darker meaning. The Millers spent sleepless nights staring at the pile of letters stacked on their kitchen counter. Each envelope carried the same threatening language: fines that grew larger by the week, deadlines that loomed closer, and warnings that their delinquency could result in legal action. But what gnawed at them most was the realization that someone had placed their home on the market without permission. It wasn't just harassment anymore, it was theft in slow motion. Determined to uncover the truth, they began documenting everything. Every notice, every fine, every strange flyer advertising their house was carefully stored in a binder. Neighbors who had quietly experienced the same harassment began sharing their stories as well. Each tale mirrored the next. Richard targeting families with sudden violations, escalating fines, and veiled threats about losing their homes. A disturbing pattern emerged. Richard wasn't acting alone. There were real estate agents who appeared too quickly, often visiting violated homes with suspicious offers to buy at below-market prices. Flyers that appeared overnight were all tied to the same brokerage firm, one rumored to be close to Richard. What at first seemed like isolated bullying now looked like a coordinated scam. Whispers spread about Richard's past. Some residents remembered stories of failed business ventures, shady investments, and debts that had never been repaid. The theory gained momentum. Richard had found a new scheme, using the HOA as leverage to force families into foreclosure, then flipping their homes for profit. It was a sinister system that turned fear into currency. For the Millers, the danger was more immediate. Each week, Richard added new violations to their record: a lawn ornament deemed unsightly, a mailbox labeled non-compliant, even their backyard fen, which had stood unchanged for 15 years, was suddenly flagged. He was no longer feared. He was pitied. The breaking point came one early morning when law enforcement arrived at Richard's home with a warrant. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as officers carried boxes of documents, computers, and files from his property. Hours later, Richard himself was led away in handcuffs, his face pale, his arrogance gone. The man who had once ruled the neighborhood like a king was now reduced to a criminal facing justice. For the Millers, the sight was both surreal and liberating. They had endured threats, vandalism, and sleepless nights. They had been pushed to the brink of losing everything. But they had refused to break. And because of that, the entire community was free. The aftermath was not immediate peace. The neighborhood still bore scars. Families had to rebuild trust, repair damage, and untangle the legal mess Richard had left behind. But with him gone, healing began. A new HOA board was formed, one rooted in transparency and fairness. Rules still existed, but they were no longer weapons. They were guidelines, shaped by the very people they served. The Millers' home, once threatened with fraudulent sales and foreclosure, became a symbol of resilience. Their fight had not only saved their house, but also exposed a man who had preyed on families for years. And while they had never sought to be heroes, their determination had turned them into exactly that. As spring returned and children once again filled the streets with laughter, the neighborhood slowly transformed back into what it was always meant to be, a place of safety, community, and belonging. The fear that once lingered in every shadow was gone, replaced by a hard-earned strength. Richard, meanwhile, faced years of legal battles. Charges of fraud, embezzlement, and harassment mounted against him. His empire of intimidation had collapsed, leaving only the cold walls of a jail cell. The story of the HOA president who tried to sell homes without permission spread far beyond the neighborhood. It became a cautionary tale shared on news outlets, online forums, and social media. A reminder of how greed and power could corrupt even the most ordinary corners of life. But it was also a story of resistance, of how ordinary families stood up against tyranny and reclaimed what was theirs. And for the Millers, as they sat on their porch one warm evening, watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of gold, there was no need for words. Their home was safe, their neighbors free, and the tyrant who had haunted their lives was finally gone. The battle was over. Justice had been served. For one family, the Millers, the harassment escalated. They had lived in their home for nearly 2 decades, raising children within its walls, pouring love and savings into every corner. Suddenly, Richard targeted them with relentless fines. First for having a small garden out front, then for a storage shed behind the house, even though it had been there for years. When the Millers refused to pay, threats followed. Letters appeared claiming that unpaid fines could lead to property seizure. The neighborhood buzzed with rumors, yet no one wanted to be the first to challenge Richard directly. Fear gripped the community, and compliance seemed safer than resistance. Still, an undercurrent of unease began to grow, as if everyone knew something was terribly wrong. The breaking point came one autumn morning when a for sale sign appeared in the Miller's yard. Shocked, the family ripped it out, assuming it was a prank. But the next day, another sign reappeared, this time accompanied by glossy brochures advertising the house as available soon. The Millers hadn't listed their property. They hadn't even considered moving. Whispers spread quickly across the neighborhood. Some claimed Richard had connections with real estate agents eager to snatch up undervalued homes. Others suggested he was orchestrating foreclosures, turning family houses into investments for profit. The fines piled higher, and the letters grew more aggressive, painting a false picture of delinquent homeowners on the brink of collapse. One evening, as the Millers returned from work, they noticed something unsettling. A car idled near their driveway, its driver snapping photos of the house. When confronted, the stranger drove off, leaving behind a lingering chill. The next day, a glossy real estate brochure arrived, featuring photos of their home, pictures they hadn't taken, images clearly stolen from that car. The house was being advertised as pending availability. The realization struck hard. Richard wasn't just threatening anymore, he was actively trying to sell their property. Meanwhile, tension in the neighborhood was reaching a boiling point. Homeowners whispered in secret meetings, gathering in living rooms and garages away from Richard's watchful eye. Stories poured out like confessions, and fear turned into fury. Families realized they were all victims of the same ruthless game. And while Richard ruled through intimidation, his empire was built on silence. It was during one of these clandestine gatherings that the Millers proposed an idea. They couldn't fight Richard alone, but together, the neighborhood might have a chance. If they could collect enough evidence of his corruption, they could take their case beyond the HOA, straight to the authorities, the courts, and even the press if needed. The plan was risky. Richard had spies, neighbors loyal to him for reasons unknown, or perhaps bought off with favors. Every move had to be discreet. Still, the group agreed. They would fight back, carefully documenting every violation, every suspicious letter, every attempt to pressure a family into selling. But as they began gathering evidence, Richard seemed to sense the shift in power. His letters grew harsher. His tone in meetings became more aggressive. At one hearing, he slammed his fist on the table, warning residents that non-compliance would not be tolerated. It was a desperate attempt to tighten his grip, but to many, it only revealed cracks in his armor. The Millers knew they were walking on dangerous ground. Richard was powerful, connected, and ruthless. If he suspected they were organizing against him, his retaliation could be devastating. Still, the choice was clear. surrender their home, or expose the corruption for what it was. As autumn turned to winter, the community braced itself. The neighborhood was no longer a quiet suburban refuge. It had become a battlefield, with Richard standing at the center, clutching his false authority like a weapon. And while the Millers gathered allies and evidence, they had no idea just how deep Richard's corruption ran, or how far he would go to silence those who dared to defy him. By the time the first snow blanketed the neighborhood, the Millers and their allies had compiled a mountain of evidence: stacks of letters, photographs of unwanted for sale signs, and testimonies from frightened families. Yet, with each discovery, Richard's behavior grew more menacing. It was as if he sensed the walls closing in and was determined to strike first. The HOA's monthly meetings became increasingly hostile. Richard wielded his gavel like a weapon, silencing anyone who dared question his decisions. Homeowners who once sat quietly in fear now exchanged knowing glances, united by a shared truth. Still, speaking openly meant risking immediate retaliation. Richard's threats had teeth, and no one doubted his willingness to bite. It was during this climate of fear that the Millers decided to dig deeper, not into the letters, not into the fines, but into Richard himself. Who was this man who had turned a suburban HOA into his personal empire? What skeletons lurked in his past? Late nights were spent at the county clerk's office, scrolling through old records, deeds, and property filings. Richard fought back with venom, dismissing the claims as lies, calling his neighbors ungrateful, even threatening lawsuits against those who dared accuse him. But the tide had turned. The more he raged, the clearer his desperation became. The crowd no longer feared him. They despised him. And when the vote was called, hands shot into the air. Nearly every resident stood against Richard. The HOA president, once untouchable, was formally voted out of office. Gasps filled the room, followed by cheers, tears, and embraces. For a fleeting moment, it felt like victory. But the Millers knew better. Richard was not the kind of man to walk away quietly. His schemes ran too deep, his greed too consuming. Losing the title of HOA president would not stop him. If anything, it would make him more dangerous. That night, as families celebrated and dared to hope again, Richard sat alone in his home, plotting. His power had been stripped publicly, his pride humiliated, and a man like Richard would not go down without a fight. The battle for the neighborhood was far from over. In truth, it had only just begun. The neighborhood was still buzzing with relief after Richard's removal. For the first time in years, families felt like they had taken back control of their lives. Children played outside without the looming shadow of fines, and neighbors spoke openly without fear of being reported. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. Yet beneath that sense of victory, the Millers felt uneasy. They had dealt Richard his first public defeat, but they knew his schemes had never been about pride alone. They had uncovered too much about his financial dealings, too many secrets he couldn't afford to let see the light of day. A man who had spent years orchestrating a scam wouldn't simply fade into silence. They were right. Within days, the retaliation began. The Millers' mailbox overflowed with anonymous letters, each one filled with venomous accusations. Flyers appeared on windshields across the neighborhood, painting the Millers as troublemakers who wanted to destroy property values. Social media pages dedicated to the community suddenly lit up with posts defending Richard, claiming he had been framed by jealous neighbors. The smear campaign was obvious, but its intent was clear: to turn the neighborhood against the very people who had led the charge. But Richard's revenge wasn't limited to words. The Millers awoke one morning to find their car's tires slashed, deep cuts leaving them stranded in their own driveway. Days later, their backyard fence was spray-painted with crude threats. The police were called, but without evidence, nothing could be done. The message was chilling. Richard was no longer bound by rules or titles. He was lashing out, and the Millers were his primary target. Behind the scenes, Richard launched a more calculated attack. He filed lawsuits against the Millers and several other families, claiming defamation and unlawful interference with HOA operations. The lawsuits were flimsy, built on lies, but they carried weight. Legal fees began draining bank accounts, and the stress of court battles threatened to fracture the fragile unity that had been built. Richard wasn't trying to win. He was trying to exhaust them, to bleed them dry until they had no fight left. And yet the Millers refused to bend. They continued working with neighbors to gather more evidence, now turning their focus toward exposing Richard's financial crimes. Late nights were spent with attorneys, digging into property records, tax filings, and bank transfers. Each discovery painted a clearer picture of fraud, of a man desperate for money who had turned his neighbors into pawns in his scheme. Then came the most shocking revelation. One of the shell companies tied to Richard had been used to funnel money into his personal accounts, hundreds of thousands of dollars traced back to properties he had forced families to sell. The idea seemed too outrageous to be true, until more signs appeared on other properties, each belonging to homeowners who had crossed Richard. The community began to fracture. Some neighbors chose silence, afraid of becoming the next target. Others quietly rallied together, comparing stories, piecing together a puzzle that revealed a man intoxicated by power. The HOA, once seen as a symbol of structure and order, was now a weapon in Richard's hands. For the Millers, the nightmare was just beginning. Each day brought new letters, new fines, new threats. The once peaceful home they had cherished felt like it was under siege. But deep inside, they knew they couldn't surrender. Someone had to stand up, not only for themselves but for every family in the neighborhood. What they didn't realize was that their resistance would set off a chain reaction, one that would pull the entire community into a battle for justice, exposing corruption far deeper than anyone imagined. As the sun set behind rows of pristine houses, a sense of unease lingered in the air. The neighborhood was no longer safe. The HOA president wasn't just enforcing rules, he was plotting to take what didn't belong to him. And the Millers were about to discover just how far Richard was willing to go to get it.